In the 1980s, the world became engulfed in fear of the devil. His minions were scattered all over the world, spreading a perverted influence over pop culture. That his followers were targeting kids and teenagers with demonic creations they could play with or listen to. A book caused this panic, and even after the book was deemed to be complete lies, it was too late. The world had fallen into madness, seeing evil where there wasn't evil, creating victims along the way, and it's still happening. There is a lot more I am not going to have time to cover. There are topics like cults and other killers thought to be in league with Satan, the rise of evangelicals and politics, all which helped form this tapestry of nutjobs. Instead, I want to hit on the last bit of important things. For instance, toys and games. Imagine, you as a young child, sitting in front of a Christmas tree, getting handed presents that Santa left for you, with your mom, dad, little brother Billy Bob, dog Pongo, and Grandma Nettie. Billy Bob opens his present, and it's a Smurf toy. Nothing more wholesome than Smurfs, right? Well, then you hear Grandma Nettie screaming up a Smurfin' storm, losing her Smurfin' mind because the Smurfs, according to what she saw on daytime television, they are in league with the Smurfin' devil. Yes, Smurfs were accused of being demonic.
Well, isn't that interesting?
And you know what happens to you when you die? You turn blue and your lips turn black.
Smurfs has gone occultic.
Very much so.
Smurfs carry a homosexual connotation in that most of them are male.
Here are more that fundamentalist idiots thought were satanic.
People don't realize that 80% of all toys on the market have occultic influence, and these are the most popular.
It says here that it actually makes the wings move, so let me look at that. Isn't that amazing? Snake Mountain. It's got an interesting little feature here. I'm going to turn it on. It can actually transform your voice from your regular voice to that of an occultic hero.
I could go on, but there's a game that kinda got the worst of it. Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, the Elf Lord's favorite role-playing game, where nerdy people can hang out in front of dice with warlocks and wizards, and I've never played it, so I don't know very much about it. To all my D&D lovers out there, I don't judge, I just jest. D&D was created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and was published in 1974. Conservative households of the 70s probably saw it as nothing more than encouraging witchcraft and devil worship, but they mostly did not pay attention to it. But then, of course, two Canadian idiots named Michelle Smith and Lawrence Pastor wrote a book of fiction passed off as real, and the world lost its freaking mind. In the 1980s, if you played D&D, you weren't seen as a nerd. No, that was probably mostly the 90s. In the 80s, you were seen as promoting witchcraft, devil worship, self-deletion, porn, and murder. Religious groups were really hardcore about hating this game. Even activist groups were created, like Patricia Polling's group Bad, bothered about Dungeons and Dragons. But shouldn't it be bothered by and not bothered about? And what do I know? On June 9th, 1982, Polling's son Irving had committed self-deletion by shooting himself in the chest. Irving had been a player of D&D, and Patricia Polling thought her son's death was caused by him playing D&D. No, it probably has nothing to do with the underlying mental issue. No, nothing like that. Back then, it was probably easier to blame other things other than mental health. She tried suing her son's school and principal, but I'm not sure why. But she claimed the principal put a D&D curse on her son. When that failed to materialize, she tried suing D&D's publisher, and that landed her a story on 60 Minutes. In 1983, she founded Bad, which had some success at making a lot of noise when it came to D&D. Bad described D&D as a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, blasphemy, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and other teachings. Can you see why the conservative Christian side really ate this shit up? Let's just say, not surprised that even a group in Australia called the Australian Federation for Decency had no issue distributing materials that demonized this game. The issue is, though, all these people were raising a fuss about a game. They didn't bother looking at the whack job that started the mess to begin with. Patricia Pulling once said of the state of Virginia that 8% of the population were Satanists. How did she come to this number, you ask? If I told you by bullshitting her way through it, would you take that as an answer? No? Okay, here's the answer. She said that she came to this figure by adding the 4% of adults who she deemed to be Satanists and the 4% of teenagers. Now, I failed math a lot, one of the many subjects in high school I either barely passed or failed, but as the reporter she talked to pointed out, and I am pointing out here, that is still 4%. The issue you're going to find is, the people who believe these wild stories and took part in this panic all have the same thing in common. They never stop to question what they are hearing, even if they seem completely stupid to the average person. They never stop to ask if what they're hearing is the ravings of the mad, or individuals looking to make a profit off of gullible masses. Patricia Pulling died of lung cancer in 1997. With her, bad ceased to exist. But we are not done with the absurdity of bashing those who play D&D. Enter a television movie with Tom Hanks in his first role, called Mazes and Monsters, which is about a guy who plays a role-playing game and begins to think it's real. This was created to warn against role-playing games like D&D, with the message that if you play D&D, your grip on reality will slip. Literally, in the movie, Tom Hanks' character almost jumps off the World Trade Center because he believes if he does and casts a spell, then he will fly. I feel sorry for Tom Hanks. There is a reason this was a made-for-television movie. The entire premise of someone losing touch with reality due to a role-playing game is, at best, ridiculous. It doesn't consider that someone might have an underlying mental issue that is causing these delusions. It isn't the game's fault, it's the individual's mind. This movie was based off of a 1981 book by the same name, which is loosely based off of the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III, who in 1979 went missing. His love of D&D was heavily covered by the press, and was looked into as a possible reason he went missing by investigators. But here's a summary of what happened to Egbert. On August 15, 1979, a note was found in his Michigan State University dorm room. It was the kind of note that you pretty much call the police and hope that someone finds him in time. Egbert was a genius who suffered from depression and was lonely. He felt pressured by his parents to succeed. He was fighting drug addiction. The fact that he was into D&D was a small part of who he was, but the press made it seem like that's all he lived for. The fact that media, when discussing this case, described D&D as a bizarre and secretive cult probably made a lot of people think this game was dangerous. But Egbert did try to end his life the same day that note was found. He lived, but he didn't show back up. Instead, he wandered around the country, lost in a daze. He was a missing person, a runaway. He tried to take his own life in New Orleans, but failed. On September 13, 1979, he was found finally. The private investigator who found him was a man named William Deere. Egbert confided in William Deere about his pressures, depression, and being unable to come to terms with his own sexuality. Deere was asked to keep this a secret, which he did for a while. Egbert died on August 16, 1980 from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. After his death, people still blamed D&D as a cause for Egbert's tragic year. So William Deere wrote a book, The Dungeon Master, where he brought to light what was really the issue Egbert was going through. He kept Egbert's secrets well past Egbert's passing, but he wanted the world to let Egbert rest in peace. Music has always been a lightning rod for stupid claims. In the 1950s, rock and roll was considered the devil's music because Elvis Presley liked to dance. In March of 1966, John Lennon said of the Beatles that they were more popular than Jesus, which sparked a little bit of an outcry where the Beatles albums were destroyed. Then you have Black Sabbath. If I need to tell you why they might be considered devil worshippers, then you should really kinda look at the name of the band again. Around the early 80s, at least that was the earliest I could find this, people began to think KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service. Considering Gene Simmons was called the Demon, spit blood, and did fire-breathing stunts, kinda easy to see why conservatives would look at a band like KISS and think Satan. But KISS does not mean Knights in Satan's Service. Paul Stanley thought up the name while sitting at a red light. But Gene Simmons and the rest of KISS didn't exactly try to squash the rumors about the name. According to Gene Simmons, the rumor started because Gene once said in an interview that he wondered what human flesh tasted like, and decided that he didn't care what Bible-thumping conservative Christians thought. Gene Simmons studied theology, by the way, so when people screamed scripture at him, he would just do it right back. But moving on to AC/DC, who is Dick Ramirez's favorite band. His favorite song? Night Prowler. So they got wrapped up in this because of Dick. And yes, I'm still going to call him Dick. Don't care. Newspapers tried to link AC/DC with Dick's crimes and style of Satanism, and stated that AC/DC stood for Antichrist Devil's Children. AC/DC is named after alternating current, direct current, two forms of electricity. In Sparks, Nevada on December 23, 1985, 20-year-old James Vance and 18-year-old Raymond Belknap were drunk, high, went to a church playground with a 12-gauge shotgun, and proceeded to shoot themselves. Belknap died. Vance lived, well, for 3 years before he died of a drug overdose. This event would lead to the 1990 subliminal message trial of Judas Priest, which was a civil trial where lawyers for the families of Belknap and Vance claimed that Judas Priest was hiding subliminal messages in their songs. In the song Better Than You, Better Than Me, lawyers claimed that if you played it in reverse, you could hear the phrase, "Do it." Vance's family claimed that though Vance was a troubled youth and had made a death pact in the past, he had re-embraced Christian faith before he became hooked on Judas Priest, and they called Judas Priest garbage. Yeah, this trial didn't last long and was dismissed by the judge. The judge stated that the subliminal message was just a coincidental convergence of a guitar chord with an exhalation pattern. There was no subliminal messages in Judas Priest songs, but there are in Weird Al songs. Two, in fact. In the song Nature Trail to Hell, the subliminal message is, "The devil loves Cheese Whiz." And in the song I Remember Larry, the subliminal message is, "Wow, you must have an awful lot of free time on your hands." In 1985, we have another issue I want to do a full video on. When Parents Music Resource Center, led by Tipper Gore, took the issue of what should and shouldn't be listened to the Senate. In fact, they composed the list. They called it the Filthy 15. Most of the songs on this list were on there for talking about sex, but two were put on there for talking about the occult. Those two were Merciful Fate's Into the Coven and Venom's Possessed. So yeah, it was a bunch of tight-ass people who wanted to censor music because they fancied themselves the morality police. But on to the Senate hearings. Standing in their way from censoring music was the lineup of Frank Zappa, Dee Snider, and John Denver. This led to the parental advisory sticker that came with CDs, records, and tapes, which, if you only listen to music on Spotify, is the E next to some songs that we all ignore. Tipper Gore and her Karens at the PMRC thought that this would change what is recorded and make music a lot more family friendly. What actually happened is those albums with the parental advisory sticker sold a lot more than the albums that didn't have them. So they are dumbasses. I could go on with this. Ozzy Osbourne, Alice Cooper, Metallica, but here's all you really need to know. While a lot of metal music was deemed satanic by conservative media and the Christian right, it didn't halt their popularity. Look at Ozzy, considered evil, the Antichrist, and a devil in his own right. Yet he is still popular to this day. While popularity of these bands didn't wane, they were used to single out people who listened to those bands as devil worshippers. As I mentioned in the West Memphis 3 video, Jason Baldwin had Metallica t-shirts. Dick Ramirez loved AC/DC. And since I'm going to cover them soon, might as well get this out of the way because while technically not a part of the Satanic Panic, still on the cusp of it. Marilyn Manson was blamed for the Columbine High School massacre, which on December 31st, covering that. But Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's actions were not because of the music or video games that they played. I bring that up because it shows a trend, that media will blame others instead of the individual. Same with the Satanic Panic. Blame bands for making music that fundamentalists feel is evil and satanic. Thus, the actions of those listening to that music is influenced by it. That goes for games too. But no, we will see more about media later on in the video. But for now, let's look at some of the cases of daycares being accused of satanic ritual abuse. For this first case, we go to Miami, Florida, home of Gators, Florida Man, and the setting for the Bad Boys franchise. Frank Fuster and Elena Flores opened the Country Walk babysitting service right after they got married. Frank was an ex-con, having been convicted of manslaughter in 1969, and in 1981 of a 9-year-old girl. In the case, he maintained that he was innocent and took a plea agreement to avoid prison. He would get 2 years probation instead. Again, he stated he was innocent. Not sure if he was or not, but because he had that on his rap sheet, hard not to look at him as guilty. In 1985, the Fusters were charged with 14 counts of child. The 14 children claiming they were forced to participate in satanic rituals, and Frank would intimidate them by mutilating birds in front of them. The children were interviewed by 2 people who did not have the qualifications to even talk to children who have allegedly gone through some horrible crimes. Lori and Joseph Braga were listed as child psychologists for the University of Miami, but Joseph was trained in education while Lori was trained in speech therapy. They became known as the Pied Pipers of child abuse. This is due to the fact that they used leading questions and coerced children to get answers they wanted to hear, much like Key McFarland did. But unlike the McMartin trial, there was no acquittals. Frank's own wife would end up testifying against him. After a false positive gonorrhea test on their son, the prosecution began to try to elicit a confession from Elena, with the help of her attorney Michael Von Zamp, who had been representing both, but dropped Frank after the false positive gonorrhea test on Fuster's son. He elicited the help of a contracting service named Behavior Changers, who used the tactic of telling the children stories to Elena and then having her imagine what would happen next. When she got a detail wrong, they corrected her. They even used hypnotherapy on her, which I have discussed the reasons why that doesn't work in my first video in this series. Pretty simple to say that Elena was also coerced. When she took the stand, Michael Rappaport, one of the members of Behavior Changers, would constantly interrupt the court to correct Elena. On the stand, she pretty much added onto the satanic ritual aspect of the case by adding snakes and feces to it. In the end, Elena pled guilty and served 3 years in prison. Frank was found guilty and sentenced to 165 years in prison. His charge pretty much didn't help his case. At most, it established a pattern. But he claimed innocence in that, and to this day, he is in prison claiming he is innocent. Ileana would go back and forth on her testimony. She recanted it, then recanted her recantation, and then recanted that, proving she is not a reliable witness. Whether or not he did the crime he is in prison for is up for debate. The tactics used against him, and the wild stories of satanic rituals, snakes, and feces being used is not. It is just too fantastical to be taken seriously, and he should be allowed a retrial to examine if there is evidence that he did those things. In Edenton, North Carolina, Betsy and Bob Kelly ran the Little Rascals Daycare Center. From 1989 to 1995, 7 people were arrested and charged with satanic ritual abuse. In January of 1989, Bob Kelly was accused of harming a child, and then everything snowballed from there. And like McMartin and Country Walk, the testimony of the children was pretty much coerced. And like McMartin, the allegations ranged from very serious things that I cannot discuss in this video to the utterly ridiculous. 90 children were interviewed by therapists. These sessions led to accusations for the people working at Little Rascals, but also other people like, for instance, a judge. They were accused of doing horrible things to these children, but also they were accused of sacrificing babies and throwing kids in the ocean with a school of sharks. So again, children's imaginations can be very weird. Also, parents of the 90 children in question stated that even before the trials, their kids didn't act like anything was wrong with them. Nothing had changed about them. There was nothing indicating anything happened. So out of the 7 that were arrested, there were only 3 that went to trial. Bob and Betsy Kelly and a woman named Dawn Wilson, who was a cook at the daycare center. Bob and Dawn would end up being found guilty and received life sentences. Betsy, being the last trial, would see the writing on the wall and hoped her chances of not getting a life sentence were high if she pled no contest. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. But in 1995, the North Carolina Court of Appeals looked over the case and found that there were a lot of legal errors in the case, so it was appealed and all were set free. I personally think it had to do with looking at the obvious coercion of the children and some of the accusations being made being more dumb than serious. But legal errors does sound better. This one's level of stupidity rivals McMartin. In Austin, Texas, Fran and Dan Keller ran a small daycare out of Oak Hill. In 1991, a child who was 3 at the time was being treated for behavioral problems. This had to do with her parents' divorce, but she ended up lobbying accusations at the Kellers. Once again, because of the limitations of YouTube, I cannot state what those accusations are. The child's mother did what any mother would do, warn other parents, and the snowball started. 2 other children ended up accusing the Kellers killers of doing very bad things. So let's look at some of the accusations. The children were forced to do videotapes that would be CP. That one is very serious and would be a reason to investigate if this was actually happening. But that is the most serious one. Now time for the more ridiculous. They were forced to drink Kool-Aid laced with blood. They stated that sometimes the killers carried candles, wore white robes, and hurt them with candles. The killers were accused of making the children watch or forcing them to participate in the dismemberment of cats, dogs, and a crying baby. Bodies were allegedly unearthed in cemeteries, and new holes were dug to hide the freshly killed animals, and once an adult passerby was shot and dismembered with a chainsaw. And the recalling of several trips in a hot air balloon to Mexico to film illicit materials, and yet somehow the killers were able to have the children back before being picked up by their parents. So these children have some messed up imaginations. The killers were found guilty and were sentenced to 48 years in prison, based only on testimony. There was no physical evidence of any kind that the killers harmed these children, and the fact that these were the accusations authorities chose to believe makes you wonder something. There was one confession that investigators didn't believe, so I am wondering what was in that confession. Because of the wild and false claims, conduct by the investigators and social workers, the case was reevaluated, where it was found that the prosecution withheld evidence, that the medical examination of the children was flawed. In 2017, the killers were acquitted and deemed actually innocent, and were entitled to compensation for the time they were in prison. The media ate all of this up. It brought in ratings. But there is a specific form of media that profited most off of the Satanic Panic. While 2020 and 60 Minutes profited off of stories from the Satanic Panic, daytime talk shows seem to just whore themselves out to it. Sally Jesse Raphael, Geraldo, even Oprah all discussed devil worship. But I wanted to look at Geraldo more than the other two, because this guy would do anything to be on the air. For example, Al Capone's vault. Enough said there. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, look it up. It's funny. Here are some clips from an episode of his show called Devil Worship, Exposing Satan's Underground.
What was it about Satanism that attracted you?
Power. Just, with power comes money, comes girls, just the feeling of people looking up to you.
He listened to the music, heavy metal music, every opportunity.
Another example of the link between heavy metal and teenage satanic crime.
I saw satanic symbols on his bookwork, and I'd spoken to him about it. Didn't mean anything, I assumed it was a passing phase. I had my things when I was that age. I assumed that he had his.
Which aired on December 22nd, 1988. On this episode, he interviewed Ozzy Osbourne, who looks like he has no idea what the hell Geraldo is on.
Exchange with Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy, I'm glad you're on the program. I'll interview you in greater detail in a couple of minutes. The one thing I have to ask you now, though, is, of course, the vast majority of your fans and the fans of heavy metal music are not Satanists. But there is no doubt, at least not in our reporting, that heavy metal music plays a role. Every single kid whose case we know about, who committed a violent act in Satan's name, was also into heavy metal music. What's your response to that, Oz?
Well, I don't really know. All I do is make music. I don't sit down and purposely plan to freak everybody out. I mean, I always have played heavy metal music. I suppose when I was younger and I started writing songs, my world was kind of dark and dingy. I came from a working class family who had nothing, no dough, no prospect of ever having much money, and so that's how I saw the world as a child. So, not all my songs are about Satanism.
Of course not.
In fact,
But Oprah did it first. The Oprah Winfrey Show was a completely different show than what it would become in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was more like one of those tabloid talk shows, where a subject would be discussed instead of her interviewing people. Daytime talk shows were everywhere in the 80s and 90s, and talking about subjects like this got ratings no matter if the topic was true or not. This helped keep the hysteria going longer as it popped ratings with shock and awe. But also, you need to understand, a lot of these talk shows were most likely scripted. It is important to recognize that. It means that what you're allegedly seeing is a show, not reality. But by the mid-1990s, the satanic panic began to subside. It didn't go away, no, just the media stopped covering a lot of the claims, because the idea of satanic ritual abuse was debunked. Those who stoked the fires had either moved on to talking about Bill Clinton's scandal, the Oklahoma City bombing, or the rise of militias in the US. It didn't end with a revelation, it ended with a silence. Not with a bang, but a whimper. But it was the end of the satanic panic being covered by the media, not the end of nutjobs claiming something outlandish in order to drum up fears. The internet is a blessing and a curse. For every cute cat video you find, there's probably a comment under it claiming that the cat is evil in some way. And in some ways, the internet brought back the satanic panic, only more evolved to fit the times. Instead of going after preschools and edgy teenagers, politicians and the elite were targeted. Do not take that statement as I feel bad for them. I just think these newer Satan-inspired conspiracy theories are really stupid. First, Pizzagate. Started on Twitter on October 30th, 2016. The Twitter handle David Goldberg NY tweeted, "Rumors stirring in the NYPD that Huma's emails point to a pedophilia ring and at Hillary Clinton is at the center. Hashtag Go Hillary. Hashtag Podesta emails 23. This Twitter account had been posting white supremacist material and was falsely claiming that the owner was a Jewish lawyer, when odds are it was just a troll. But hashtag Podesta emails 23 is a reference to John Podesta's emails, which were being published on WikiLeaks in October and in November. This led to a Reddit post that linked Comet Ping Pong, a pizza place in the Washington, D.C. area with allegations of harming children, and apparently keeping kids locked in their basement. Which, by the way, Comet didn't have a basement. How do I know this? Because some idiot who believed this went out of his way to try to, quote-unquote, save the children. Edgar Madison Welch traveled from North Carolina to the pizza place with an AR-15, shot twice in the air, and ordered staff to take him to the basement. Well, there was no basement. He was shown that, and he ended up surrendering to the police that showed up. While Pizzagate was stupid, QAnon takes the cake, which is so stupid that I'm really surprised people believe this. For one, it was started on 4chan. While users of 4chan have done some good when it comes to finding people who hurt animals, that is alongside porn, gore, and pretty much anything you can think of. Pizzagate was also on 4chan too, by the way. But to summarize, QAnon is the belief that Donald Trump, while president, was fighting a cabal of satanic individuals who were exploiting and eating children, and sacrificing them. The Q stands for a high clearance level in the government. But honestly, this started on 4chan, moved to 8chan, and both are sites where people can post whatever they want and remain anonymous. If this was really happening, why not go to WikiLeaks, or post this to Fox News, or something besides 4chan? It is fake, by the way. Some troll came up with it. But stupid people like Sidney Powell and Marjorie Taylor Greene and others believe this horse shit. This is more in line with the satanic panic. Shocking content about children, Satan, and a conspiracy that reaches to the depths of society. Politicians, actors, billionaires were all named in this conspiracy. It seems that we will never get rid of the crazies believing stupid shit. As a person who thinks themselves a free thinker, I find that some of these cases and claims are just stupid. Not because I do not believe in the devil or evil. There are evil people out there looking to exploit the most gullible among us. But when you sit down and really think about everything that transpired then and today, you have to ask yourself, who would think this is real? Unfortunately, people do see it as real. To some people, the battle between the forces of darkness and the forces of light is a real thing. It happens all around us. And to some extent, it is. But not to the level of satanic ritual abuse or QAnon. Sometimes it's best to sit back and ask if a story is too sensationalized, too out there to be believed. If the media is just looking for your attention rather than giving you facts, odds are, if it's too fantastical, then odds are, it's probably fiction. As we will see on December 31st, sometimes the story is so muddled in fantastical thinking that it becomes hard to know what the truth is. On December 31st, I'm going to discuss Columbine, the facts, the fiction, and how the media painted that picture completely wrong.